Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the third through 10th episode of the first season of Kidding. So, when watching the first two episodes, I think kind of shortly thereafter this, I was like, you know what, how about I just watch the rest of the season and just review the first season? Like, I think ultimately for me, I was kind of hooked on the fact that recently this show has shock value, and so when going into it I was just kind of like, you know what, I really like this show just because of how like odd and or different it is. And so recently I just thought it was kind of really fascinating that the longer that we go on to the show, how we have it to where we have a person and or people that are supposed to be carving the path of the youth of America, basically, and really just mentoring them and helping them try to get through their lives, or ultimately, if there's a complex or complicated issue, that ultimately they can go to Mr. Pickles and solve all of this. So I thought it was just fascinating that we had it to where everybody eventually is going into a, I guess you would maybe call it like a midlife crisis or something like that. Like it seems like every one of these characters are eventually getting to a breaking point. And that's what I kind of thought was really fascinating about this show. And the only real true part that I thought was a little confusing was kind of the points of which to really understand what was the more present day stuff and what were flashback things. And ultimately, I got a little confused about that. But reasonably, other than that, I thought that reasonably we had it to where also Jeff was also losing his mind. So some of the stuff that was kind of going on within these episodes were really just the fact of um, Jeff, who is Jim Carrey's character, is ultimately kind of losing his freaking noggin. His mind is going crazy. But anyways, I thought that it was also interesting how eventually we have it to where Jeff ultimately goes into having seemingly a connection with a person, which ultimately we'll talk about how many times Jeff had not only connected with other people, but connected with a person especially. But there were so many times while I was watching the show where I was just godsmacked about it because when looking at it, I'm like, God, this is so odd how we have it to where all of a sudden there is some woman that is otherwise getting some pleasure from a man, and then all of a sudden she is watching uh, seemingly Mr. Pickle's show. And for some reason it must have just like got her out of this funk that she was in at some point in time. But anyways, that is just one bizarrish thing that ultimately like leads me to uh, just kind of talk about the show and how like all of a sudden you're just gonna see somebody just thrusting away, if you know what I mean, and we're eventually to see where people's lives are otherwise to head afterwards. So let's ultimately, yeah. So we have it to where everybody uh, is eventually going to lose their stuff. I think the only person that is only gonna keep like a cool head out of all of this is probably got to be Jill, who ultimately was Jeff's wife at some point. Um, and ultimately we have it to where I think Jill is ultimately kind of thriving in the aftermath of really what is to all be quite possibly to end up almost with Jeff maybe at this season or maybe not. Also, we have Jeff who is seemingly mixing it up. It seems like um, he is helping out people, and eventually it seems like some people are wanting to help themselves out with Jeff, if you know what I mean. Um, so eventually we'll get there. So Recently, some of the points in this episode, or in this review, I mean, some of these episodes I might have to jumble them around a little bit, and ultimately we're gonna get to some points about here, but I really liked this show, and even when it has some absurd things going on, or some just kind of like, huh? Kind of moments, recently I just thought that this show was just really just fascinating to watch. How basically this is kind of built to seemingly like this is built to reasonably be for a kid show at first, but then eventually more and more that you go into these episodes, you can realize how this show is really catered for adults a lot more. But it's just kind of done with like a whimsy or of a just kind of adventurous like quality and whatever what have you. But eventually you'll understand why exactly that this show is much more on the adult spectrum. So let's go out of our way to spoil this show. Let's talk about it. Ultimately, I'm just going to kind of go a roundabout ways of ultimately talking about whatever is going on in the show. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil who this show. So ultimately, we have it to where Jeff is ultimately seemingly unbalanced. We have it to where reasonably Sebastian is ultimately scrambling to get a alternate variation of Jeff instead of actually having Jeff himself. We have it to where within these episodes we're having Jeff ultimately having to put on like a Jeff on ice kind of thing, or ultimately we are having a animated Jeff, or ultimately we are having Jeff do a doll of sorts. So they're trying as much as possible to rank in the money for this show to also try to eventually find some alternative to actually Jeff. So Jeff ultimately is getting outraged by the idea of anything being like slapping his face on it and trying to make money off of his face, off of his voice, off of his anything. And so we have it to where eventually Jeff is in a downward spiral to ultimately try and not have them do Jeff on ice and all kinds of other things. We have it to where eventually it seems that Sebastian is going to call upon a man that sounds just like Jeff and is, I think he's like Sumerian or something. So we have it to where ultimately Jeff is ultimately dealing with the weight of this show to the point to where, in all hilarity, we eventually just have Jeff after having to forcibly like voice a doll, which ultimately he has to give certain kind of like voiceover choices, and Jeff ultimately is demanding that he's like, you know what? Okay, I'm willing to do the doll, but reasonably, I'm wanting to do my own choices of what of what the doll will say, and they have it to her like, okay, well, what is he gonna say? So we ultimately have it to where while this is going on, we ultimately at some point have Jeff ultimately to go to his apartment. He's not in this season. We have it to where he's basically just abandoning his home that he had bought, and he's going back to his apartment. So we have it to where at one point that Jeff ultimately sees his, as per usual, drunken, blacking out neighbor. And funny enough, we have it to where he is trying to ultimately, as per usual, get her keys to ultimately help her into her apartment, and she has passed out drunk. Ultimately, to realize that her neighbor is ultimately having her friends ultimately be banging away And so when he opens the door, like people are shouting out um, that they're doing it, and ultimately uh, don't come in, kind of thing. So we have it to where Jeff's character ultimately says, "Well, I'm sorry," and so he ends up dragging his passed out neighbor into his home. We ultimately have to where Jill at some point is had come to Jeff's apartment, and she ultimately had said, "It's like, okay, why is it that you live here? It's like, you could live at like some 4-star like hotel and have the lavish life of which you could always have wanted." And Jeff's like, "Nah, you know what? I like living here. It's okay." We have to where Jeff is ultimately seemingly sleeping on a fold out futon of sorts, and so ultimately we have it to where his neighbor is to ultimately be sleeping on his couch, and ultimately we have Jim's character who is getting into uh, a astronaut squirrel onesie looking thing, and because ultimately he's writing a note to somebody, and we have it to where his neighbor is asking for water. So we have it to where Jeff goes out there to get her water, and ultimately we have it to where this girl is ultimately like going like, "Man, you are so nice," and this and that, and eventually we get to the point to where she ultimately is going in to kiss Jeff, to where reasonably Jeff doesn't want to take advantage of a drunk person, and so reasonably he pulls away just because it's like, you're blackout drunk, like I can't take advantage of you. And we ultimately have it to where his drunken neighbor is ultimately saying like, "Well, like, aren't you kind of tired of just doing everything good? Like, aren't you just tired and worn out of just always being the good guy?" So we have it to where eventually, like, I think that really spurns Jeff slowly but surely, like, starting to ultimately just kind of just start to kind of really like get upset, get angry, just for the fact it's like, well, like, yeah, it's just how I'm built. That's just how I am. That's just how he is, kind of thing. And ultimately, for people to either not accept that or otherwise have to ridicule him for it is ultimately just making him just reasonably just lose his effing mind. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably Jeff is to ultimately just consistently uh, go and seemingly talk to either Make a Wish people or seemingly consistently trying to like try to win over some people that are seemingly very sick. So we ultimately have Jeff who is making his way to talk to some people that are ultimately dealing with cancer and this and that. So we ultimately have it to where Jeff is making his way through this hospital, and we have it to where Jeff is using like a puppet to just kind of make people feel happier. And we eventually get it to where Jeff is talking to Vivian, and ultimately Vivian is realizing how like uh, pointless what he's doing is, and how kind of just pointless um, like where her life is heading to, where ultimately she only has seemingly a month to live, and so ultimately uh, like as quickly as she can just kind of finish up her last month and be done with everything, like. And so we ultimately have it to where Jeff is ultimately looking at her, and he's ultimately just like, well, basically, if you're already on your way out, why did you stop and get a manicure, kind of thing? Really ultimately having it to where Jeff is kind of reminding Vivian that, hey, like, you still are like living your life. you still have time to live your life, and it seems like you're doing something with it. So, like, why don't you do something with your life while you still have it? And we ultimately have it to where Vivian easily clings on to Jeff, and ultimately we have a bedroom business moment with Jeff and Vivian, and then ultimately we have it to where because evidently both of them are now like really trying to live their life, and we ultimately have it to where Vivian is living her life with Jeff inside her, let's just say. So we end up having it to where ultimately Jeff is to uh like have a moment with Vivian, and then ultimately it seems like the moments after that are ultimately like Jeff texting Vivian. It's like, well, I had a really good time last night. When are we ever going to do this again? And so Jeff ultimately texts her, and then ultimately he's waiting for a response back to the point to where he's starting to ask people. It's like, hey, like, have I been getting a text and I don't know it? Like, is there something wrong with my phone? And ultimately, we have to everybody and the brother is saying like, well, maybe there is something wrong with your phone. Maybe you need to get an upgraded phone. And we eventually have it to where Jeff goes and ultimately is going to a person, a phone technician, and it seems that ultimately Jeff is going to get eventually a upgraded phone at some point. So we have it to where eventually Vivian is to text Jeff and ultimately mention, oh hey, I'm sorry I couldn't get back to you because my phone is broken. I'm like, yeah, what a convenient like thing to tell somebody. But I think it also kind of is just kind of a laughable thing of this story to ultimately just say, yeah, maybe her phone is broken, and so ultimately we have to where Vivian ultimately says that her phone was broken, and I thought that that was kind of funny, but. Um, yeah, I thought that that moment was just kind of like really interesting to just maybe have Vivian just go like, well, um, like maybe I will keep going with Jeff just because ultimately like what else do I have going on, and plus with Vivian kind of seeing the slow but surely issue of her not being able to find anybody else but Jeff with the time that she has left, she might as well just keep holding on to Jeff, and if by holding on we are basically to see them consistently do bedroom business acts together. So we eventually have Jeff like paying for Vivian's treatments, ultimately to have her keep living, keep breathing, um, because eventually we have it to where Jeff take uh, is to ultimately to take Vivian into his set to ultimately show him everything, and ultimately have it to where Jeff is going to do something nice for her, Vivian, by getting a sweater that ultimately she would wear and ultimately put it on some puppet and ultimately calling this character like Lisa Lost Pages or something, kind of a goof off of Viva Las Vegas. So we ultimately have it to where this librarian is ultimately to tell Vivian that ultimately, um, because Vivian had ultimately said that she really wanted to uh, see what it would look like if she were older and gray and everything like that. And so we have the puppet that is ultimately gray haired and old. So we have it to where Viva Las Pages is ultimately telling Vivian that it's like, well, like, hey, I'm wearing your sweater if that's okay with you. And ultimately, Vivian is completely okay with it. And we have it to where the to where Lost Pages is ultimately telling um, that reasonably there are so many people that end up giving her their stories to finish, we ultimately have it to where she ultimately gets so clumsy and drops all these books and says, yeah, like, now I have to ultimately collect all these people's stories and finish them all. And so ultimately, when Vivian is to leave, we have it to our lost pages. The puppet character is going to finish Vivian's story, is going to live um, the rest of her life for her, kind of thing, which I thought was really touching and really fascinating. So eventually we have it to where all the puppets end up coming out and end up doing a song just for her, to ultimately have her kind of realize how much Jeff is going out of his way to ultimately tell her that Vivian needs to continue her life. She needs to finish the rest of her pages of her book. So we ultimately have it to where Jeff is ultimately hugging Vivian and telling her that what would you want to do? What would you want to do if you had more time? And we ultimately have to where Vivian is mentioning that she wants to go and travel and go to these locations that have these special events and this and that. And we have it to where Jeff is consistently saying, like, go on, go on. She's ultimately mentioning she wants to go to first class, where ultimately she can have a fork and for her to have a first class experience and everything like that. So we have it to where ultimately we are going to have to stop at this moment here and kind of talk about everybody else's kind of journeys that are kind of going on, because there are some other people in here that we have to talk about. So we eventually have Will, who ultimately is seemingly a character that is just really just a person that is just a dope fiend, and we consistently have it to where we're just kind of consistently seeing Will just smoke grass, to the point to where in some portion of the show we eventually have Sebastian ultimately go and uh, ultimately go and talk to Will about his weed smoking, because we eventually have it to where Sebastian confronts Will about his weed smoking by basically them smoking a thing of weed, and then Sebastian says is like, okay, well, you're never going to smoke a thing of weed again in your life. But eventually we have it to where Will, towards the very tail end of this episode, goes to a party, because ultimately he is trying to nab a girl. But we'll talk about that later. So ultimately, we also have it to where Deidre is ultimately seemingly having a problem with her daughter. Her daughter is consistently throwing her hands up and yelling at the speed of words. Ah! She's screaming at her out of her lungs. And so reasonably we have it to where there is consistent background noises of this girl just going consistently through these episodes. Ultimately, we have it to where it seems that Deidre is ultimately getting a divorce, it seems, and we have it to where her and Scott, we have it to where Scott is just kind of like putzing around of whether or not to be with Deirdre or not, or to go with the piano playing teacher. And we have it to where even Scott is trying to get with the piano teacher, and it seems like the piano playing teacher wants no business with Scott. So it ultimately seems that Scott has to forcibly go back with Deirdre, but we have it to where Scott is ultimately going and having seemingly a midlife crisis of sorts, to ultimately just kind of mention that he hates his job and he never wants to go back to it. And so ultimately, we have it to where Scott is ultimately having this conundrum of ultimately telling his wife that ultimately, through a metaphor of words, because we ultimately have it to where Deirdre and Scott are ultimately talking while they're daughter is technically in the room, and they're mentioning about clarinet and piano, where ultimately Scott is mentioning that I think his daughter is never going to go back to being a piano player. Maybe she never really wanted to truly be a piano player. And basically, the metaphor is basically mentioning that Scott is saying that he never wants to go back with the piano playing teacher, that ultimately he wants to stay with Deirdre, that ultimately Scott was playing with being with a piano guy, but ultimately knowing full well he has Deirdre here, and ultimately he'll stay with being with Deirdre. All in metaphors and so on and so forth. So we also have it to where there seems to be a Mr. Pickles coming from another country. We ultimately have it to where seemingly there is a Mr. Pickles that ultimately is retiring and is moving off to give a younger Mr. Pickles a turn at bat, let's just say. And we have this Mr. Pickles that is ultimately going to the American Mr. Pickles because he is the originator of all this. And we find out that this foreign Mr. Pickles, if I can say that, ultimately is trying to learn from his culture and taking notes on what Mr. Pickles is doing. Funny enough, we have to where Mr. Pickles or Jeff is ultimately losing his during this time. So this foreign Mr. Pickles is kind of learning some bad habits. But anyways, we also have it to our reason. We have this foreign Mr. Pickles, and I'm gonna have to figure out this guy's name at some point, because there's only so many times I could say foreign Mr. Pickles. Anyways, Mr. Pickles son, yeah. Basically, I could have just said that anyways. Mr. Pickles son. So we end up finding out that Mr. Pickles son is ultimately talking to Deirdre, and it seems that ultimately Mr. Pickles son can't speak English that well. But when you when you give him a puppet, that seems to be different, which I thought was interesting. To ultimately, we have it to where recently Deirdre is grabbing a puppet just to be able to talk to Mr. Pickles' son. So we eventually have it to where Mr. Pickles' son is eventually talking to Deirdre and talking about how damaged she is and how basically she needs to uh, be able to be a puppet. Like even at some point we have it to where uh, I thought it was really interesting how Deirdre was trying to help Jeff figure out what puppet he is. Because ultimately we have it to where Deirdre is, when she comes up with a puppet, like there's stages of that, which I thought was really fascinating. And we have it to ultimately Deirdre is desperately going to Sebastian and ultimately saying, I want to become a puppet. And we have it to where Sebastian is ultimately telling her, it's like, well, you can't be a puppet, but you could be behind the scenes orchestrating the puppets or making the puppets. Like, but you're not actually going to be a puppet on the show. So we ultimately have it to where Deirdre is talking about how broken and scarred that she is, talking to Mr. Pickles, and I thought this dialogue was fascinating. How we really get to really find who Deirdre is through this dialogue, and I thought that it was fascinating. But anyways, we eventually push on to ultimately have it to where Mr. Pickles is spending quite a bit of time with Deirdre, And when ultimately we have it to where Scott is ultimately leaving to go and try to find his piano player and it doesn't work out, or ultimately we have it to where Scott and Deirdre are having some issues and they're having some arguments, or ultimately Deirdre is ultimately telling Scott, it's like, you're gay, gay to gay, gay, gay. You're so gay. Like, if anything, you're going to like leave me for another man at some point because that's who you are, kind of thing. And we have to where Scott is like, no, like I don't think I'm ever going to be that. Like I think I'm fine now. I think everything is fine. And so ultimately, their arguing is ultimately pushing them apart, and we ultimately have it to where Mr. Pickleson is ultimately trying to put on a performance for uh, for Deirdre using all kinds of things, seemingly even having Mr. Pickleson using his wang as a thing to have a puppet. And I'm like, what? Because ultimately we have it to where Scott is ultimately walking in on Mr. Pickleson, laying down, doing this puppet show, and Scott is just like, oh my god! Like, did Mr. Pickleson end up having an affair with my wife? Because it looks like Mr. Pickleson did his like weird, absurd like puppet show, which ultimately was like really outrageous. But and and Deirdre was ultimately just kind of looking in the back, not being any part of this puppet show, if you know what I mean. So we ultimately have to where Scott runs off, ultimately thinking that Mr. Pickleson and Deirdre had had a bizarrish affair, which makes no sense. But anyways, we eventually have it to where Deirdre is just so frustrated with her husband that, and recently she had mentioned that she hadn't really been pleased by Scott in a very long time. Um, and so ultimately we have Deirdre that is basically forcing herself onto Mr. Pickleson, ultimately mentioning it's like we need to get together, and Mr. Pickleson is like no, like if anything, Mr. Picklesons have vowed a thing of chastity, and there's no way for us to be able to do this, and so eventually we have it to where Deirdre and Mr. Pickleson end up going and performing this act anyways, and we end up having it to where Deirdre ends up talking to him with a puppet, and I just thought that was the most absurd scene like going on in here. But anyways, so that is going on, and so we just have this combative thing with Jeff and Sebastian over over Mr. Pickle on ice. We ultimately have it to where eventually we have it to where Jeff ultimately meets the skater that is going to be Tara Lipinski, and ultimately she is going to be Jeff on ice. We have it to where at some point Jeff is kind of giving in at first to the whole concept of Jeff on ice because there's nothing that he could do. So eventually we have it to where Jeff ends up buying these like high end expensive shoes to ultimately just give them to Tara, uh, to ultimately just say that like, oh, okay, well you are me now, like you deserve these kind of shoes, and ultimately we have Jeff walking away at some point because there's nothing that he could do to make his life back to what it was. We ultimately have it to where Jeff is ultimately saying that Sebastian is going to at some point get rid of him and ultimately phase him out. Like ultimately, like we have it to where Jeff is seeing Mr. Pickles on ice, and basically he's realizing that's like, well, so you're gonna try to phase me out. You're gonna try to make me a toy or make me a cartoon, and you're gonna eventually get rid of me, which are horrible ideas. And we have it to where Sebastian is like, well, just like just ultimately just kind of go with us, and we ultimately have it to where Sebastian is going to have writers on the show, to ultimately come up with ideas for the show. So Jeff ultimately ends up going into, as soon as he has to put together words for this doll, we end up having Jeff going completely off the rails after that, to where Jeff is just consistently saying nonsensical things that ultimately are to basically 100% make this show uh, seemingly not the rating that it is supposed to be. Like, we have it to where Jeff is ultimately talking about ecstasies and the persecution of people and like all this kinds of things that ultimately you would not be able to say in a youth show, or a show that is otherwise going to be catered to a certain audience. And we have it to where Jeff is saying all this nonsensical stuff, and we have it to where Sebastian is ultimately trying, like, well, how about we just kind of edit the show to have it be that whatever Jeff says is okay to a young audience, and we have it to where the editor is going like, well, there's only like 7 minutes worth of real show here, and even if we like commercialize the crap out of it, like there's no way that we can find enough footage to that has Jeff doing something that is ratings friendly, or the rating of this show friendly, youth friendly. And so we have it to where like Sebastian is ultimately just having like a meltdown on the show, just because Jeff won't do anything that they say. He's trying as much as possible to be the guy that ultimately buzzed the middle of his head and stuff like that. And that is the main reason why they are thinking about having Mr. Pickles on Ice, or ultimately having an animated thing, just because so that way there won't be a guy that is to be out of control. They can keep him in control. And so eventually we have it to where uh, the whole thing with Vivian. So eventually we have it to where everything is going well with the relationship between Jeff and Vivian, and we have it to where like reasonably this entire show is really resting on Jeff and his relationship with Vivian, to where eventually Sebastian is ultimately trying to welcome Vivian into their home, so to speak, and welcome him everywhere, because Sebastian is like, oh, thank God that Jeff has a relationship now that is ultimately going to like even him out. But then eventually we have it to where Vivian is to meet Jeff's entire family and go into this seemingly dinner, and this is after we find out that Vivian is in remission, and because ultimately we have it to where Jeff ultimately goes with his son uh, to uh, to some place of which that Vivian wanted to go to, but was too sick to be able to do it. So Jeff ends up going and having a Zoom kind of thing, where ultimately he had bought a tablet to ultimately have her come on to the journey with him. And I thought that that was really interesting. We ultimately have it to where Jeff is ultimately kind of showcasing Vivian, like all the stuff that is to go on here, and I thought that that was really like touching and interesting, and everything along those lines. So, but eventually we find out that Vivian is eventually in remission, and so we end up having it to where Vivian is to meet Jeff's whole family, and it seems that Vivian is at some point going to mention that since she is a little bit better, she is thinking about wanting to go on a trip. And so, since everybody has easily fallen in love with Vivian right out of the gate, and everybody's like, I really like this girl, we ultimately have it to where Vivian is ultimately like is talking about this trip, and everybody else is chiming in, and they're all saying like, "Yeah, how about we all go as a family together?" Like I'm already thinking about all the shirt ideas that we can ultimately um, have together, like. Uh, the pickles trip or whatever. There's so many ideas that everybody's coming up with. Everybody's like, yeah, I can't wait to be a part of this trip. Like every single person is all chiming in to ultimately say like, yeah, I want to be a part of this family trip. Let's all go together. Yeah, this will all be great, and so on and so forth. And everybody's just like they can't wait to all go on this trip together and how fun it's gonna be. And then we ultimately have to where Vivian is ultimately um, going and saying that she's like, well, no, I actually thought it would be nice if I just went on this trip by myself. Because ultimately, when thinking about it, uh, like everything is all nice and all, but like I just want to do this on my own. And we have it to where eventually we have Vivian breaking up with Jeff because ultimately like she's realizing that every time she's looking at Jeff, she is reminded about her almost dying. She's reminded about her cancer and she's reminded about the life that she almost lost. And we ultimately have it to where Vivian is breaking up with Jeff right here and there, and we have it to where every single person in this family, with the exclusion of Jeff, is ultimately telling Vivian to f off. F off, Vivian. You, Vivian. How could you do this to me? You betrayed me, Vivian. Off. F you, Vivian. And so I thought that this scene was freaking hilarious, even though Vivian is just crying and in tears and running off. But every single person in the family is telling her to f off and to tell her to leave, and like everyone feels betrayed. But Jeff is the only one not saying a single thing. At some point, Jeff and Vivian are ultimately spending a nice, fine dining night together, and we ultimately find that Jeff is ultimately, with all the pressure and all the problems that he is having, uh, like Jeff is ultimately having an escalation of like in his mind becoming a volcano that is ultimately going to burst. And ultimately, he is at some point now like being like magma and all this weird, bizarre, metaphorical stuff, basically saying that this guy is going to erupt at some point, and to where he's keeping so much stuff like kept. Because ultimately he ends up smacking the table and ultimately says like "effing table" or something like that. Where Vivian's like, "What did you just say?" And we have it because ultimately Jeff is so irritated that this table is so wobbly, and it's just we have it to where Jeff ultimately wants to like have his elbows on the table, but the table is too wobbly, so Jeff is losing it because of that. So eventually, we get to a point to where reasonably Sebastian is still going on with Jeff on ice, regardless, because we have it to where Jeff ultimately had tried as much as humanly possible to derail Mr. Pickles on Ice, ultimately talking to Tara to not, please not do this, to ultimately do something else besides what she was doing. And we have it to where it was going to be uh, Tara Lipinski and the people of Mr. Pickles' uh, life on ice or whatever. And so they were going to do that, but we have a Torres Sebastian is still pushing anyways to have there be a Mr. Pickles on here because it wouldn't make sense without one. And so we eventually have it to where Laura's sister is to ultimately go on here and portray this Mr. Pickles. So we end up having here where we have Jeff who is ultimately going and seemingly have a Make-A-Wish kid who is going to see Laura because evidently this Mr. Pickles uh, fan loves not only Jeff but also Laura. And so we have it where Jeff is ultimately talking to this Laura fan, and ultimately he is going and having see or having blah, blah, blah. So we ultimately have Jeff who goes in here and sits next to this Laura fan who is also his fan, and so we have it to where this kid is ultimately mentioning that he can't stop looking at Laura or otherwise she will fall or something will happen to her. And interestingly enough, we have it to where Jeff is ultimately going and calling somebody, and we eventually have it to where this kid is ultimately to look away for a second, and he looks back, and Laura ends up getting a blade in her throat for her troubles, and she ends up falling over, and we have it to where did I see Laura? Tara. We end up having Tara ultimately fall to the ground with with a skate blade in her throat, and eventually we ultimately see Tara going to the hospital. So we end up having it to where this all is to accumulate all to where Jeff has to go on live TV and ultimately go and do a Christmas tree lighting. And because ultimately we have it to where Jeff has certain obligations that he has to do, and Sebastian is ultimately going, yeah, I don't think it would be good to be having him on live TV. And so we also get to also see towards portions of the season, we get to see that Jeff ultimately was in hockey, and we seemingly have it to where Sebastian is ultimately driving his son to beat the living crap out of other hockey players. And ultimately, it seems that eventually we have it to where Sebastian is talking to Will about uh, being in a sport, and we have it to where uh, Sebastian is trying to find some way for Will to ultimately hurt other teammates, even with something as simple as baseball. So we end up having it to where there's a consistent scene of Sebastian ultimately going and beating up a hockey player, but reasonably the hockey player isn't a real person. It's some kind of uh, like painting of the or picture of some hockey player getting beaten up, or ultimately it's a picture of now Sebastian's father at some point getting beaten up by Jeff, and so on and so forth. So every person that evidently Jeff beats up, it's actually his father that he's trying to beat up, I guess. Some bizarrish metaphor of sorts. So we end up having eventually Jeff go in here, and he is to eventually go on to go to this tree lighting. And so we have it to where ultimately Jeff is on live TV now, and we have it to where Sebastian knows that this is going to go horribly awry. And so ultimately, before this, we have Jeff getting a unknown call from this voice actor that had ultimately come from some bizarre country, which I thought was really funny. So ultimately, we have Jim Carrey, um, who is ultimately doing this voice, sounding just like Jim, who's sounding just like Jim. And so reasonably we have it to where this caller is ultimately telling Jeff that he needs to end his life and do all kinds of horrible things, so that way they would push this voice actor to do this animated show. And ultimately, the quicker that this guy Jeff could ultimately end his life, could ultimately push this other guy to get a career. So with all that going on, eventually we have, before this light ceremony ends up finishing this whole season, Eventually, we have it to where Jeff is ultimately flashing back to the point of where him and Jill were still together, and I thought that these moments were kind of confusing because ultimately during current time, it seems that Jeff and Jill are kind of making a little bit of headway. But anyways, we eventually have it to where Jeff is ultimately in some flashback where ultimately he is seeing his sons perform a magic trick. Where ultimately we have it to where Will and Phil are ultimately making this appearance and disappearance act where we have Jeff uh, kind of walking into one room and opening a door for his other brother to appear in some other room and come out of uh, some portion of the house. For ultimately, we have Sebastian going like, "Oh my God, what a wonderful magic trick that you're putting on!" So eventually, to where bizarrely in Jeff's warped mind, we have it to where this peanut butter and jelly puppet is ultimately to make this same magic trick, and I thought that it was weird. So ultimately, it seems that in the show they are trying to work peanut butter and jelly into the show to ultimately we have it to where Jeff is to ultimately play around with um, the peanut butter puppet. We ultimately have it to where recently Jeff is ultimately. I thought there was an interesting moment where we had Jeff ultimately trying to play a puppet with a heart. Where ultimately he rips out his own heart, and we have it to where people's like he just ripped out his own heart. Like, dude, we can't do this. But also, I thought it was really funny. There was one entire episode where we had it to where Mr. Pickles had its own app game, where it was like a shoot 'em up kind of game, where ultimately we have like all these images of all of the um, like Mr. Pickles puppets and whatever, and we just had a gun that was all shooting them down. To ultimately we had to where like Sebastian ultimately telling like, oh, okay, whoever was to put up this game, we gotta go and find them and sue them. To ultimately we have it to where Jeff is actually playing this game and crazily playing it. Um, we end up having it to where ultimately Sebastian is mentioning like make sure that this game is taken down before eventually Jeff sees it. And funny enough, Jeff is actually playing this game. So pushing on, so we have it to where I think everything else is kind of cleaned up or cleared up. So we have it to where Jeff is ultimately going to this Christmas tree lighting, and he's going on TV, and he is mentioning how he had failed the youth of America, and how he had um, like how ultimately he is telling all his kids to go and find a secret spot that their parents would ultimately hide things and try to find their Christmas presents and open them all early. And ultimately, we have every single kid who's getting their Christmas presents. Ultimately, all of them are all the Mr. Pickles doll. And ultimately, he's saying like, yeah, pull the string, and you'll find that ultimately, like, you'll have a person that is ultimately going to listen to you because no one else will. Which I thought was like this moment where we have kind of Jeff talking to these kids was actually a really beautiful moment when looking at it because if there's no one that's going to listen to him because ultimately we have usually Jeff mentioning that like the reason why Jeff was ultimately to have this kid being put in front of him what on a TV screen was really just to um, seemingly have this kid's parents going off and just doing whatever they wanted while ultimately Jeff was really just a distraction for this kid to ultimately just be hooked onto this TV. Um, and so recently we have it to where so we have it to where Jeff is kind of mentioning about like how there's certain parents that are ultimately just boozing their way, or are just awful parents, and ultimately you're just kind of having this TV for this kid to be a distraction, and ultimately, um, and how Jeff has really just failed them. And so we eventually have Sebastian, who's on the phone with the guy that is sounding just like Jeff, and ultimately we have Sebastian, who is telling this guy lines to say, through Jeff's voice, knowing full well that Jeff has basically burnt his whole entire show down to the ground. And so we really have it to where, and here's one thing that I forgot about. Uh, so we have also, interestingly enough, we had one girl, speaking of TV. So we have it to where recently we had one blonde girl who ultimately I know had done a thing of Big Bang Theory. Uh, and so eventually she is on this show. I want to figure out if I can find where she was at some point. Uh, all right, well that's Cheyenne. So Cheyenne was ultimately reasonably going at it with some man. Ultimately, she was trying to have like really just kind of uh, shut out all the things that were going on in her life, to the point of her eventually just looking onto this TV screen. Um, Ultimately, we have it to where Jeff ultimately ends up going, and he's starting to want to date again. And so ultimately, Sebastian gives him all these fan letters of women that are to ultimately uh, want to be with Jeff or date Jeff, or find some woman that is seemingly close by. And so eventually, Jeff ultimately dates Cheyenne, and it seems like that this date is ultimately going really well. But eventually, this date is ultimately just kind of thrown to the side because eventually Jeff goes out with Vivian. Um, but I'm like, okay, what was the point of that whole date? Because I was thinking in my mind, like, what was the point of that date? Like, it didn't go anywhere. There was no conclusion to that, really. Like, it didn't really like. It should have went to, maybe in the next season. There's maybe going to be a backpedaling to that. Um, but ultimately, we have it to where after eventually we have it to where Jeff ultimately is done with this live TV thing. Eventually, we have it to where Jeff ultimately is to uh, annihilate his desk, toss everything around at some point, and we ultimately have one guy who is ultimately coming to him to try and help him. Because we reasonably have it to where Jeff ultimately is to have spoken to a guy that was on death row. There was evidently a guy that had murdered people with a hammer, because ultimately this guy had lost control. And so ultimately we have it to where Jeff um, is ultimately to have seemingly a prisoner that he wants to go and see him uh, and talk to him, and then ultimately also go and see when this guy is getting his lethal injection. Um, we have it to where eventually that Sebastian doesn't want Jeff to be incorporated in this, and this is like a flashback uh, of a lead up to eventually get to current time. So we eventually have it to where, and I'm kind of mixing around this whole timeline thing, but there's a whole reason for this. So eventually we have it to where Jeff is ultimately to go and give the letters to uh, to this death row inmate's son, and we ultimately find out that this son sees the very back of these letters, and it's to show a whole entire map of this big thing. Because ultimately, we have it to where this son is the only person that is going to read these letters, and while reading these letters, he sees this design, and ultimately, we have it to where he does this whole entire poster, and it's like, wow. So we end up having it to where reasonably this kid ends up having a dinner uh, with Jeff, and ultimately they end up talking about this guy's father, and ultimately Will, who is Jeff's son, ultimately is going and talking um, about all these like questions like uh, about all the like awful questions about this guy who's going to die in death row, about like did he know what he was doing, like did he remember he killed all these people, and so on and so forth. And we ultimately have it to where Jeff is ultimately just outraged about the insensitivity of Will, that he pulls him aside and ultimately tells him, it's like this kid, this guy uh, had this guy has absolutely nothing, and he has not wanted to ask for a thing, and you have everything and you're asking for everything. It's like, how about you learn some humility and ultimately just be nice to this guy, and so on and so forth. Jeff is yelling at his kid, and rarely do you ever see it, but then you realize that Jeff at some point is repetitiously yelling at this kid, ultimately telling him to put a seatbelt on, and all kinds of things. So eventually you're starting to see Jeff being a stern father at points, just because reasonably uh or maybe it's wait a minute, maybe it's not, no, it's not Will, it's Phil ends up dying. So yeah, um Jeff is remembering all the moments with Phil, ultimately leading to his death, because we have it to where Phil ultimately didn't have his seatbelt on when that accident happened, which ultimately led to Phil's death. So, but here's the point that I'm making. So, reasonably after the whole entire tree debacle, and eventually Mr. Pickle's son ultimately rushes to try and light the tree, and eventually somebody tackles him down, thinking that um, he's some terrorist or something. We ultimately have it to a reasonably they end up deciding to pull the plug on Mr. Pickles, and ultimately just go in and try to salvage whatever episodes they have left. To ultimately they end up forcibly having to showcase the episode of Mr. Pickles talking about death. Um, it seems like that whole tree incident opened up for kids to all go to Mr. Pickles and start talking to him like he's Santa Claus, and ultimately mentioning all the stuff that had led them up to the whole them watching him on TV for that night. And so ultimately we have a bunch of kids all coming to the studio, all wanting to talk to Mr. Pickles. And ultimately there's like a line out the door, and we have where Sebastian is all seeing these kids all talk to Mr. Pickles. But so eventually we have it to where seemingly, and here's a fascinating point. We ultimately have it to where recently there was one kid where ultimately they had Mr. Pickle signing some pickle jar, and eventually we have it to where Tara is ultimately there with a Mr. Pickle's head on, and we have it to where uh, Jeff is talking to some kid and ultimately saying like, well, hey, like, you do realize that there's a difference between me, the me you see on TV, and the me that you see over there. And ultimately, we have it to where this kid is like, Yeah, like I know the difference. It's like ultimately, you on TV is the you that's on TV, and you that's here is the real you, and ultimately the person that is over there is Mr. Pickles on Ice. There's several different variations, and so Jeff was just kind of like amazed by the intelligence of this girl and figuring this all out. So we eventually have it to our reasonably. Jeff is ultimately just kind of watching what is ever left of this show, and ultimately, the TV execs are just kind of telling him it's like, yeah, we're just gonna cut our losses, and we ultimately have it to where Sebastian is ultimately getting this phone call and ultimately saying like, well, f you for saying crap about my son. Uh, so we ultimately have it to where reasonably everybody's packing everything up. They're trying to sell as much as they can off of this show, and ultimately we have it uh, to where they're seeing everything, every single thing, just come down from the studio, even to the point of uh, Jeff and this one kid who ultimately had been the one to see, or the one to have this death row inmate father, eventually becomes a guy that is going to take phone calls for this studio. And Jeff is looking at him. He's like, "Yeah, I bet your father would be proud that you're working here, that you're a part of this, that you're part of this show that ultimately he had loved." Or ultimately, we have it to where this death row inmate's father wanted to eventually imagine that ultimately after he died that he would be in um, the land where Mr. Pickles had ultimately wanted or thought about or told him about. So, anyways, reasonably, that's just kind of how this season ends, with them just kind of like selling off and getting rid of all this show, and we eventually having everything just kind of diffuse and just ultimately just be the way it is. To where ultimately the very last ending of this show, we ultimately have it to where we have it to where Jill and Pete are ultimately going and sleeping together. We ultimately have it to where Jeff and Jill are ultimately to before this they are trying to spend some time together. It seems that ultimately Jill and Jill and Jeff are ultimately playing a baseball game together with Snow. I don't know if this is a flashback or not, but eventually we have it to where seemingly Jeff and Jill are ultimately trying to make strides in their relationship, and we ultimately have it to where Jill is ultimately saying like, no, there's no way that this is all going to work out, because Jill is ultimately um, happier that ultimately she is not a part of Jeff's life or being with Jeff. Because when looking at it, when their son died, basically Jeff was the only real important thing in their relationship. And now that Jill is separated with Jeff, now Jill is actually important. Jeff is actually like, she broke it down as if mentioning that ultimately when uh, when their son died, they had been getting so many letters, and it was all addressed to Jeff, not her. Because ultimately, we have it to where Jeff is the metaphorical Santa Claus, and ultimately, we have Jill just being Mrs. Claus, and like she is forgotten about consistently. To ultimately, we have it to where Jill is wanting to never be in a real relationship with Jeff, because ultimately, like, she will never have her time in the sun. She'll never have her spotlight, and ultimately her going and trying to have a vastly different life after breaking up with Jeff is just to the fact of like she wants to be her own person and wants to remember nothing of the time that she had with Jeff, because ultimately every single minute is reminding her of the time that she wasn't important enough, the time that she had to live in Jeff's shadow. And I thought that that was like, I was like, wow, this is like and metaphorically like showcasing like giving the whole like Santa and Mrs. Claus thing was like, I thought that that was really amazing to break that down like that. And I thought that that was like you have it to where Jeff is, yeah, he is Santa Claus. He's bringing joy to the world, and we have it to where Mrs. Claus is just at home making cookies or doing like whatever she needs to do to help with the North Pole, and like yeah, you kind of forget about Mrs. Claus. In a lot of stories, you don't even have a Mrs. Claus in the North Pole. At some point, you just have Santa Claus. So, anyways, we have it to where Jill is ultimately on her way to see Pete, and we ultimately have it to where Pete is ultimately going to the neighbors because evidently there is loud music going on and he needs to be up at 4 in the morning. So we have it to where Pete is going to the neighbors to ultimately realize that his I guess be almost uh, stepson is over at this party, ultimately going and having uh, seemingly kissing this girl, and ultimately going to end up having there be more. And we eventually have it to where Pete is ultimately to go in there, and he is ultimately to see this girl and his son starting to make out, and Pete is like, well, like, hey, like I didn't see you here and I didn't see anything, and ultimately I just want you guys to just could you quiet down the noise a little bit, like if anything, like come on. So we end up finding out that Pete ends up finding out that evidently this home was actually Jeff's. It seems like he sees all of the clothes of which that Jeff had, and so eventually we have it to where um, Pete goes and walks out the door to find Jeff making his way to his house. And so we have it to where Pete and Jeff have this moment where ultimately uh, Jeff is talking to Pete and mentioning how that he is so happy that Pete is ultimately a mentor to his son, and then ultimately Pete's going to make a great dad for his son and everything like that. And ultimately have it to where like both Jeff and Pete are having this really tender moment where both of them are kind of like mentioning how they really like one another and everything like that. And so eventually we have it to where Pete and Jeff are having this great exchange, and then Pete ends up saying like, hey, do you want to smoke some weed? And Jeff is like, you know what? No, no, thanks. But I'm gonna go and leave, and I gotta get out of here. So we have it where Jeff gets in his car and he runs over Pete, and then ultimately he goes, whoops. And like that is how we just kind of finish up this season, with ultimately there being seemingly Jeff running over Pete on purpose, and ultimately to lead us to think that uh, that Jeff had run this guy over just because he had decided to smoke a thing of weed, and ultimately we were to assume with this party that Pete is technically a bad father because ultimately he's not a biological father of Will's, so why should he have to punish his son or whatever that's not really his? So, anyways, I think that's all that I need to say about this show. I think really towards the tail end here, we really get some interesting stories, and Like especially that whole metaphor with like Santa and Mrs. Claus. I thought that that was a really interesting metaphor. And so, reasonably with that, I think I am going to get out of here. I really liked this show. I'm hoping that eventually I will have time to watch the second season. Maybe I'll have to go into like every couple of episodes and just kind of break that down. Not have to do a whole entire season in one shot. I've ultimately been doing that lately, and I think I'm going to go back to try to like avoiding doing that. Just because I either want to like do shorter seasons or ultimately shorter episodes or shorter something, because ultimately I've been looking at it, the more or longer that I have certain episodes, the more like just tired I will be. So ultimately I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye everybody. Goodbye everybody.